We live in an era of unprecedented psychological assault. Every single second of your waking life is being actively hunted. The microscopic vibration of the glass and metal rectangle in your pocket, the blinding blue light of LED screens illuminating your bedroom at 2 in the morning, the relentless invisible data streams carefully engineered by armies of behavioral psychologists to hijack your dopamine receptors. We are completely drowning in noise. We are living through the most severe attention famine in the history of the human race. And to survive this modern apocalypse, humanity has frantically resurrected an ancient weapon: silence. But the silence we are being sold today is not the silence of our ancestors. It is a highly engineered, aggressively commodified, and clinically sterile version of a 3,000-year-old psychological technology. We call it mindfulness. In the modern zeitgeist, it is pitched as a gentle panacea, a soft-focus remedy for the burnt-out desk worker, sold in digital app stores for a monthly fee and mandated in sleek corporate wellness seminars by smiling human resources executives. But that is a profound, beautifully marketed lie. True mindfulness was never meant to be comfortable. It was never meant to make you a more productive employee. It was designed to completely dismantle the very foundation of your reality. Let's step out of the deafening roar of the modern attention economy and journey back into the brutal, unforgiving origins of the human mind's ultimate operating system. We trace the root code of this mental architecture back roughly 2.5 millennia, long before the invention of the printing press, the silicon chip, or the modern pharmaceutical industry. We arrive in the stifling, humid river plains of the ancient East, where the air hung heavy with the scent of rotting vegetation and monsoon rain. Here, a radical counterculture emerged. Individuals stripped themselves of all wealth, abandoned their families, erased their social identities, and marched into dense, predator-filled forests to do something utterly terrifying. They sat still, for hours, for days, for years. They were not trying to lower their blood pressure, and they certainly were not trying to sleep a little better before a big meeting. They were launching a systematic, ruthless, and highly dangerous siege against the human ego. Feel the agonizing physical toll of this original laboratory of consciousness. The damp heat pressing against bare skin, the relentless bite of unseen insects, the agonizing, gnawing cramps of starvation in the gut, and above all, the screaming, terrifying rebellion of an untrained brain violently demanding stimulation. There were no guided audio tracks. There was no ambient background music. There was only the raw, crushing weight of absolute silence. These wandering ascetics mapped the chaotic, overlapping storms of human thought with the granular precision of astrophysicists mapping distant galaxies. They meticulously documented the relentless cycle of human craving and human aversion, etching their dangerous findings onto fragile, dried palm leaves that would eventually spark a global psychological revolution. They discovered a terrifying truth: human suffering was not inflicted by the external world, but was constructed entirely within the dark, folded gray matter of the human skull. By forcing their attention onto the raw, microscopic sensation of the present moment, the exact friction of air entering the nostrils, the microscopic expansion of the ribcage, the fleeting, sharp burst of a physical pain in the knee, they essentially hacked the brain's default mode network. They proved that reality could be entirely edited, not by changing the physical world, but by completely shattering the lens through which it was viewed. And in that terrifying silence, they annihilated the illusion of a permanent self. For millennia, this potent psychological technology remained strictly locked away within monastic walls, fiercely guarded by generations of ascetics in heavy, dyed robes. But human civilization rapidly evolved, and so did our capacity for self-destruction. By the late 20th century, the global industrial machine had engineered an entirely new kind of suffering. We conquered widespread famine and eradicated ancient plagues, only to quickly replace them with chronic anxiety, massive spikes in hypertension, and a relentless low-grade existential dread that sat perfectly behind our eyes. The modern brain was redlining. It was overheating. It desperately needed a biological software patch. Let's tear down the clinical blueprint of how this ancient practice was smuggled out of the monastery and forcefully injected into the modern medical establishment. The massive pivot began in the late 1970s with an ambitious young medical researcher at a prestigious northeastern hospital. He realized something incredibly dangerous. If you strip the mystical dogma, the religious iconography, and the cultural baggage from these ancient ascetic practices, you were left with a devastatingly potent, biologically measurable tool. He began wiring skeptical practitioners to massive electroencephalogram machines, meticulously tracking the electrical storms firing across their cerebral cortexes. The clinical data pouring out of those machines was utterly impossible to ignore. This was not magic. It was biological engineering of the highest order. If mapping the hidden architecture of the human brain and decoding the raw psychology that drives our species fascinates you, hit that subscribe button. We dissect the complex machinery of human nature every single week. Now, returning to the cold, hard clinical evidence, let's look at the sheer mechanical force of a single mindful breath. When you forcefully command your attention to anchor onto the present moment, refusing to engage with intrusive thoughts, you are triggering a massive, measurable cascade of neurological events. The amygdala, that ancient, almond-shaped cluster of neurons responsible for processing fear, anxiety, and the primal fight-or-flight response, physically loses volume. It shrinks. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, the sophisticated command center positioned directly behind your forehead, responsible for executive function, emotional regulation, and complex problem-solving, literally thickens. The gray matter density visibly increases on an MRI scan. You are physically rebuilding the hard drive of your own brain. Every single time your mind involuntarily wanders to a humiliating memory from 5 years ago or a catastrophic fabricated projection of tomorrow, and you forcefully drag that attention back to the physical sensation of breathing, you are performing a neurological bicep curl. You are strengthening the vagus nerve. You are slamming the brakes on the sympathetic nervous system and flooding your entire body with a stabilizing heavy wave of parasympathetic calm. Cortisol levels violently plummet. Heart rate stabilize. Blood pressure aggressively drops. The researchers took this raw, undeniable physiological data and packaged it into a sterile, highly structured 8-week clinical program, presenting it to an exhausted, deeply skeptical modern medical community. They tested it on the hardest cases imaginable: patients suffering from chronic, agonizing physical pain, individuals who had been completely written off by the absolute limits of modern pharmacology. And the results defied all conventional medical logic. The physical pain in their bodies did not miraculously vanish, but the intense psychological suffering attached to that pain entirely evaporated. The patients fundamentally learned to observe their own agony as a detached, floating sensation, a passing storm of electrical signals rather than a permanent, defining state of their existence. The breakthrough was absolute. Mindfulness was rapidly reclassified. It was no longer an esoteric Eastern religion. It was a biologically validated, scientifically replicated superpower. But history dictates that whenever humanity uncovers a superpower, a massive, ruthless industry rapidly emerges to exploit it. And this is exactly where the narrative twists into a bizarre, dystopian irony. As the irrefutable clinical data poured into the mainstream, the global corporate titans took intense notice. The very mega-monoliths of industry and technology that were actively destroying human attention spans suddenly positioned themselves as the ultimate saviors of our mental health. They aggressively stripped away the radical, ego-destroying essence of the ancient practice, deeply sanitized it, and transformed it into a multi-billion-dollar corporate wellness product. Welcome to the grim era of McMindfulness. The exact same secretive tech empires that employed armies of behavioral scientists to engineer addictive, infinite scrolling social feeds suddenly started offering quiet rooms, nap pods, and guided breathing sessions to their severely burnt-out engineers. The internal logic was cold, calculated, and deeply cynical. A stressed, anxious, sleep-deprived worker is a wildly inefficient worker. By teaching the workforce to internally manage their own stress, the corporate mega-entities could extract even more labor, pushing productivity to absolute breaking points, entirely without addressing the systemic, toxic 70-hour work weeks that caused the psychological burnout in the very first place. Mindfulness was successfully weaponized as a sophisticated tool for corporate compliance. But the hypercommodification of ancient silence did not stop at the corporate office door. The radical practice of doing absolutely nothing was successfully monetized into a recurring digital subscription service. Silicon Valley empires built sleek pastel-colored applications, charging millions of desperate, anxious users a premium monthly fee simply to listen to a soothing voice telling them how to relax. They actively gamified inner peace. They introduced aggressive login streaks, push notifications, and glowing digital badges to reward you for sitting still. Imagine the staggering, dystopian paradox of receiving a vibrating electronic alert on a piece of glowing glass, a device specifically engineered to fracture your attention, reminding you that it is now time to be present in the moment. The modern iteration of this ancient ascetic discipline is now sold back to us in bite-sized, heavily branded packages. It has been perfectly tailored to fit into a tiny 15-minute gap between grueling corporate video conferences, serving as a quick psychological reset to ensure you can confidently keep participating in the relentless, grinding machinery of modern capitalism. The radical, terrifying act of entirely dismantling the self has been replaced by the shallow pursuit of merely optimizing the self. We are no longer trying to reach enlightenment. We are just desperately trying to be 10% more productive by Tuesday afternoon. Yet despite the incredibly heavy layers of corporate gloss, cynical marketing, and algorithmic gamification, the core underlying technology of mindfulness remains unbroken. It survives because it is fundamentally biologically true. You cannot patent the human breath. You cannot trademark the raw, unfiltered experience of human consciousness. As we hurtle further into an increasingly synthetic future, a terrifying future dominated by artificial intelligence, incredibly convincing deepfakes, and hyperrealistic virtual realities, our baseline biological grip on truth is going to heavily erode. Our raw attention is rapidly becoming the most valuable natural resource on the planet, heavily traded on invisible digital markets by autonomous algorithms that know our deepest desires far better than we do. In this rapidly approaching era, the ability to violently reclaim your own focus will not just be another fleeting wellness trend. It will be the ultimate act of modern rebellion. The near future of mindfulness will likely split violently into two extreme factions. On one side, we will undoubtedly see deep biofeedback integrations, wearable neural interfaces that physically measure your brainwaves in real time and forcefully trigger parasympathetic responses through haptic feedback, a completely automated synthetic zen. But on the absolute other side, a fierce underground counterculture will inevitably rise again. People who realize that true, unshakable agency comes entirely from the agonizing, unassisted discipline of sitting completely alone in a quiet room, confronting the chaotic, screaming machinery of their own minds without a screen, without a digital application, and without a smiling corporate guide. The true legacy of those ancient ascetics starving in the humid forests is not a beautifully designed, pastel app icon on your smartphone. It is the enduring, radical, and terrifying realization that you are not your thoughts. You are merely the silent, untouchable observer sitting silently behind them. We spend our entire lives frantically running from the present moment, endlessly litigating the mistakes of the past or paralyzed by dreading the uncertainties of the future, absolutely terrified of the deafening silence that waits for us when the screens finally go dark. But that silence is exactly where the actual truth lives. Mindfulness is the agonizing, beautiful art of finally refusing to run away. It is the quiet, powerful reclamation of your own existence. If exploring the deeply hidden forces that shape human behavior, unmasking the massive psychological systems of our world, and mastering the complex architecture of your own mind sounds like a journey you are ready to take, then hit that subscribe button right now. Join our exclusive community of deeply curious minds as we continue to ruthlessly decode the invisible rules of reality, one cinematic story at a time. The noise of the modern world is absolutely deafening, but together, we can learn to finally hear the signal.